My name is Phoebe. I am a medical writer and the client enablement manager here at TriloDocs. I have over 7 years of experience in medical writing, science communications, and in healthcare marketing.
And hi, I'm Barry Dries. I hail originally from the west coast of North America, California, where I got a PhD in molecular biology at the University of California, San Francisco. That was where sort of cloning and everything got started. But I then went to Europe and was a medical writer for almost 40 years. And that experience is what we have used to base what you're going to hear about today, our expert rule designed AI system for medical writing.
Let me be the first to say, welcome to the future of medical writing. The current explosion of AI is creating significant opportunities, for example, in identifying data signals, document creation, and therefore in supporting the work of medical writers. So what are some of the current challenges that we face as medical writers? To create a clinical study report, medical writers have to manually screen and interpret potentially thousands of pages of study data. It's a lengthy clinical process. Developing and testing new medicines involves a series of clinical studies, which can take over 10 years to complete. There can be signals hidden across hundreds of tables, which can therefore be missed when manually passing through the data. It's a manually intensive process, with medical writers currently taking approximately 2 to 4 weeks to create the first draft. The stakes are high. Errors and oversights can lead to year-long delays in approvals, potentially risking delaying access to life-saving treatments and then incurring significant additional costs. So let's have a look at how we can apply artificial intelligence in a meaningful way to enhance the medical writing space. AI eliminates the simpler, mundane tasks such as copying and pasting background information. It creates in-text tables and can write basic sentences that summarises key data. AI can look for clinically relevant signals in mammoth databases, which avoids human error in finding signals amongst millions of data points, and it presents them in a format that is easy to understand. The medical writer's role then transforms into strategist and advisor, with a focus on how the data can support the planned messages. The medical writer has more time to explore deeper meaning, such as subgroups or additional analyses. AI-assisted medical writing gets drugs to patients faster. So, let's meet TriloDocs. TriloDocs is a rule-based artificial intelligence platform which has high accuracy and consistency due to its deterministic rule-based model. It has efficient automation that streamlines report generation and incorporates clinical relevance based on expert experience. TriloDocs offers advanced content generation, which surpasses simply just content reuse. It populates text with data based on these established rules. It has a browser-based operation, which processes Word and RTF files currently, and no long-term data storage is involved. TriloDocs is intended for experienced medical writers who have reviewed the source material and understand the study well. They know what needs to be presented in the final report, and they will then refine the AI-generated output alongside the wider clinical team. TriloDocs generates a Word file in the Transcelerate template, which is an industry-recognised structure. Therefore, medical writers can work as usual, as there's no new system to work in. The results text and in-text tables are produced for all key parameters, with text highlighting any data of clinical relevance. There is no bulky repetition of data, with a lean focus on message. Most of the methods come from the protocol, amendments and SAP. The introduction is taken as is with suggestions for how to reduce it, as per the Transcelerate template. Anything that happened during the study, such as an audit, should be added manually. All key data are presented in text, it just needs to be adapted. This is the equivalent of highlighting key data in the source material, except it's already been put into the text. So how does TriloDocs actually change things? Well, with the TriloDocs process, the medical writer will first inform the tool using the wizard questions, which I will show you later during the platform demonstration. This can take up to 2 hours. They will also upload the source material, which takes less than 5 minutes to do. TriloDocs will then generate the output, which can take 5 to 10 minutes. The medical writer will then download this output and then craft the first draft, which could take 1 to 3 days. This gives a total time to complete the first draft, including methods and results, just 2 to 4 days with TriloDocs, rather than 2 to 4 weeks, which is the usual time seen without TriloDocs. We proudly adhere to the strictest global standards, such as GDPR, HIPAA, AICPA SOC, and ISO 27001. TriloDocs ensures transparency, maintains data privacy, and upholds the highest ethical standards in artificial intelligence-assisted clinical documentation creation. Now let's have a look at some of the key advantages that TriloDocs could offer medical writers. Well, first off, TriloDocs accurately finds the signals in the data. The risk of overlooking any important signals is either reduced or gone completely. TriloDocs has been designed to show more rather than less, giving a conservative approach. I personally would rather TriloDocs give me more that I can go in and delete what I don't want, rather than not give me enough and I then have to go searching through the data for a needle in a haystack. Secondly, TriloDocs consistently aids assessment. It identifies clinically relevant findings whilst giving transparent explanations as to why. This is particularly relevant when it comes to safety, which often has no predefined rules for the clinical relevance between groups. For advantage number 3, TriloDocs offers time savings in multiple departments at different stages. For example, whilst reviewing CSR shells and mock reports, data review meetings are much shorter, and for QC editorial at the end. QC currently only looks for whether, for example, the 15.86 in the source table is the same as the 15.86 in the report. TriloDocs takes this a step further by also explaining whether or not this data point is clinically relevant. And finally, we've found that TriloDocs can also function as a medical writing tutor. TriloDocs will give comments and suggestions to show medical writers what to think about, which shares a uniform way of approaching what to consider. It explains any cut-offs for data selection and gives tips on what medical writers can think about and adapt. We'll now move on to the TriloDocs platform and output demonstrations. First of all, we'll take you on a whistle-stop tour of the TriloDocs dashboard. Then I'll pass you over to Dr. Barry Drees, who will show you some example source files before giving an in-detailed view of the output that TriloDocs generated. So this is what you will see when you first log into TriloDocs. This is the main dashboard, which is where you can find any of your previous CSR drafts. If you decide to save and quit your draft partway through the process, you can go in and make changes to it by pressing this edit button. If you decide that you no longer wish to keep a draft, you can remove it by pressing this delete button. To create a new CSR, you go to the big button at the top here that says Create CSR. Now here's where the TriloDocs CSR crafting process begins. First of all, you'll need to enter a study name. This will be the name of the file you download at the end and what this draft will save as on your TriloDocs dashboard. Once you have named your draft, you'll come to the file upload stage. This is where you upload the main files that TriloDocs needs to craft your report. The clinical study protocol, the statistical analysis plan, and any tables and figures. You can upload each of these files by pressing the Add button under each section, then by either browsing your computer files or by clicking and dragging the files into the dialog box. Your files will then be uploaded into TriloDocs, which you can see by either checking the upload status boxes or by watching the upload status bar at the top of the screen, which both show when a file is being processed and when the uploads are complete. The next stage is where you'll inform TriloDocs on what you want to see in your CSR draft. The wizard questions are vital in making sure TriloDocs can make the most of the data you've given it. As you go through and answer all of the questions, you can take a look at the guidance notes to make sure that you are giving the best answers for your study. Once you have answered all of the wizard questions, you can save your answers and move on to generating your CSR draft. This can take a few minutes, which is no time at all when compared to the weeks spent manually sifting through page upon page of tables. Once TriloDocs has finished generating your report, you can see here which sections TriloDocs was able to craft. For example, this study had no Kaplan-Meier figures. You can then download your CSR file as a Word document by clicking the Download button at the bottom of the page. If you perhaps have some new data you wish to add, or any other changes, you can upload the new files or save your new wizard answers then press Generate again for TriloDocs to create a new draft, which you can then download as a new Word file. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Barry Dries and his presentation of the source material and TriloDocs output.
Okay, thank you, Phoebe. I'm going to share my screen, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of tables, which are sort of standard clinical study TFLs, and then we will look at the output that TriloDocs generated for that, which will help to illustrate a number of points that Phoebe made in the opening set of slides. So let's, without any further ado, let us get started here. And you should now be seeing a table, subject disposition table. And this is kind of standard for subject disposition. You have the different categories of subject disposition. But the important point of this table is to see the study design and what's being done and what's being compared. If you look at this, you can see there's a placebo arm, there's Fab drug low dose, there's Fab drug high dose, there's then Fab drug total, which simply adds these two together. And then there's overall, which is both Fab drug doses plus placebo. This is a kind of typical output, but you can see the challenge already for a computer to know which of these columns need to be compared and how should they be compared. It's not obvious that it's done all the same way, and you'll see how TriloDocs deals with that. You direct the tool to do that through the so-called wizard questions. So we'll look at a few more tables. Here's demographics, and you can see it's the same kind of structure with placebo, low-dose Fab drug, high-dose Fab drug, total and overall. And over here, you have your various demographic and baseline characteristics. Now, however, when we go to efficacy, you can see there's a different structure, and this can be a challenge for AI systems as well. So here, instead of the placebo, low dose, high dose, we have comparisons. We have low dose compared to placebo, we have high dose compared to placebo, and then we have Fab drug total compared to placebo. We have this for week 2, week 4, week 8, and week 12 with all the accompanying statistics. So going into a table like this and knowing what's primary and how to interpret that is going to be an issue, and that's something we've worked long and hard with TriloDocs to achieve. Many AI tools don't even bother with efficacy due to these challenges. And then finally, when we go safety, this is basically a TEAE table, and as you can see, it goes back to the placebo versus low dose versus high dose structure, and then here we have system organ classes and preferred terms. And as you can see, this is pretty normal, a very long table full of adverse events. So let's take a look at what TriloDocs did with that. Here it is. And we see right away, good news, it has populated the Accelerate template with information and text and tables and so on. And let's start with the introduction. The introduction, as I think Phoebe briefly mentioned, comes from the protocol. That's always the first step that a writer would do. They would take the protocol text, paste it in, and then they would discuss with the team, do they want to shorten it? Do they want to lengthen it? What do they want to do? There's various approaches to this, ranging from the extreme lean medical writing approach, where you say just a reference and say, see Appendix 1, protocol, to completely rewriting. I've seen these many, many pages. 2 points I just want to make. First of all, it tells you, TriloDocs, what it did. So it never just does things. It says, note to writer, this is the complete introduction from the clinical study protocol. The Trancelerate template recommends half a page, and ICH recommends a maximum of 1 page. You should therefore shorten the introduction accordingly, if necessary, discussing this with the clinical team. So if you look at this, I'm not going to go through it all, but it's about 10 to 12 pages. That's obviously very long compared to what the guidances say. Some people, however, like it that way. Some people simply cut it in and leave it, knowing that the reviewers don't spend a lot of time looking at this. But you know what you have, you know where it comes from, and you can then work with the team. And this is what Phoebe was referring to when she said the text or the output from TriloDocs needs to be adapted, polished, adjusted in some way. These are the kinds of things we're talking about. You will also notice, though, that it takes all the references, marks them with a hyperlink, and puts them into the reference section of the CSR at the end. Okay, the other thing I will show you in the data independent part is the objectives. And here it is, again, done in the Transillerate format of a table with objectives and endpoints. We have primary, we have secondary, and so on. It goes through the protocol and pulls them out and puts them in here. Similar to what it does for many of the other parts. But at the end of the day, data independent sections of the CSR are not super interesting. What's much more interesting is what it does when there's actual data. So let's take a look at that, and we'll go to the first table I showed you, disposition of participants. We see that it says a flowchart depicting subject disposition is shown in figure 1. If we look then at figure 1, we see a nice flowchart. This is what is recommended in ICH, and I personally, as a medical writer, am a big fan. You can often see things going on with the numbers of participants that are much harder to see if you just have it in a table. And as we can see, this came from that table I showed you. There's the screened population excluded, randomized to placebo, low dose or high dose, and then there's safety, discontinued, and subjects completing double blind. 2 points I'd like to make here, and one is this is a true flowchart. As you can see, you can adjust it, you can move it around, you can change numbers, you can add a treatment arm if you want, you can do whatever you want. And that's really important because some tools would simply paste this in as an image, and then you can't change anything. You can only completely replace it and put in a new one. The second point to notice is you can see some footnotes in here. There's footnote 1, 2, and 3. And when you go down, you notice TriloDocs has put in a whole bunch of footnotes, and it tells you what it did. All the footnotes from the source have been included. The writer should check each one for appropriateness and relevance and delete those that are not needed. So we can see we have all these footnotes. We saw 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are not in this figure. So almost certainly the first thing I would do is delete 4 and 5. And there we have it then with the reference listing so we know where it comes from. Now our figure's ready to go. So TriloDocs has gone into the table, pulled out all the numbers, put them in a flowchart so that you're ready to go, and made it very easy then to adjust the footnotes so that they fit for your table. We thought about trying to have the computer read the footnotes and understand. It turned out to be very challenging, and so it's just easier. We put in all the footnotes and you can pick the ones you want. Okay, now let's go to demographics. And here we see right away, the first thing that jumps out is this in-text table. And it resembles, because TriloDocs puts it in that way, the end-of-text table. And we have the Fab drug, placebo, low dose, high dose, total, and overall for the various demographic characteristics. Couple of things about this table. First of all, if you don't want all of these columns, it's really easy to just remove the ones you don't want. So some people might say, hey, we don't really need overall or total here, since we're really just seeing whether you can compare these 3 groups. The other thing is it puts in all of your characteristics and demographic variables, including each category, whether you really need it or not. So for example, if this was my study and I had race Caucasian 100%, I wouldn't bother with a row saying other 00000. Furthermore, you see there's height, there's weight, there's BMI. A lot of people, when they have BMI, they don't feel they need height and weight, so they delete those. That's up to you, though. And if you read the text, selected demographics and baseline characteristics are shown in table 2. Good. Now comes the thing that TriloDocs does that really sets it apart from other AI tools. And it says, the only relevant difference between the treatment groups for demographics and baseline characteristics that could influence the interpretation of the efficacy or safety results was for the following. And we see it's picked something out, genotype 1-1. If you look down through the demographic, you see these genotypes, and it tells you only one was considered by the expert rules in TriloDocs to be potentially able to influence the interpretation of efficacy or safety. And that was genotype 1.1 has a 10% or greater difference, or greater than 10% difference 39.5% for Fab drug low dose group, 50.6% in the Fab drug high dose group. You may feel that's important and could influence efficacy and safety, and then you want to make sure you mention how it would influence efficacy or safety in those sections. Or you might decide, no, this is the difference it picked, but you know what? That's not clinically relevant, in which case you would delete this and you would put there were no relevant differences between the treatment groups for demographics and baseline characteristics that could influence the interpretation of the efficacy or safety results. Why is this sentence so important? It's something I have been teaching as part of lean medical writing for years. Too many people use the text here to simply say, the mean age in placebo was 40.1, the mean age in low dose was 39.8, without saying anything about it. But why do we look at demographics? Why is it so important that it always comes first, whether it's a report, a summary, an investigative brochure, or publication? You want to know if there's anything in here that would change how you could interpret efficacy or safety. And to give you an example where it shows the dangers of this, I once had a report where the mean age in one group was 67, in other words, elderly, and the mean age in another group was 55, not elderly. So which one do you think had more deaths? Clearly the elderly. But they, since they just said mean age was repeating all these numbers, hadn't said anything in demographics, and then in efficacy and safety, they didn't mention it. They simply said there were more deaths in this group than the other. True, but it had nothing to do with, or may have had nothing to do with the treatment. It was simply a result of the mean age. So this is why this is so important. And now when you see this, TriloDocs has said any other differences in here are less than 10% for something like this. And then there's categories for age and sex and so on. If you don't trust TriloDocs, you can take a look and you can see, for example, the differences in mean age here are trivial. Same thing with percent, gender, and so on. And that's where TriloDocs really shines and why so many people who've used it say they like the peace of mind you get, because you know it has gone through all the demographic variables and baseline characteristics and tells you this is the only one with a difference greater than 10% for ones based on percent differences. Obviously, there are different cuts for the various things, but these are all based on my many years as a medical writer and those of my colleagues at Trilogy, adding up to roughly 200 years would be my guess of medical writing experience and what differences tend to have an effect on the interpretation of efficacy or safety. Okay, now let's take a look at efficacy. And when we go here, we see some text, and then we see an index table here. The index table is pretty much what you'd expect. We know that the primary analysis is at week 12, and we have placebo with the change from baseline, Fab drug low dose, and then the comparison, the treatment effect to placebo, and the high dose comparison to placebo. A quick look, and you see the 95% confidence intervals for treatment effect are both negative in both cases, which means they're both statistically significant. And you can see that's confirmed by the p-value. But what does the text say? Well, the text says for week 12, the study met its primary endpoint. For the primary efficacy analysis, the difference in, and this is the analyte name, positive and negative syndrome scale negative factor between low dose and placebo was statistically significant. The next paragraph appears to say the exact same thing. For week 12, the study met its primary endpoint, with the only difference here being that this is for the high dose, whereas this is for the low dose. Now that's a typical kind of computery way of writing. It'll say one thing and then it'll plob through the text saying pretty much the exact same thing for the higher dose. I wouldn't write it like that, and this is again an illustration of what Phoebe mentioned when she said the medical writer that adapts it. I would probably write for week 12, the study met both its primary endpoints, and then say low dose was statistically significant and the high dose comparison was statistically significant. Okay, this is fairly straightforward because you have some nice statistical comparisons. You did a sample size calculation, and this tells you right away whether these differences are meaningful. Safety, on the other hand, rarely has that, and it's much more of an interpretive thing. So let's take a look at what TriloDocs does for safety. So we go to adverse events, and we're going to go straight to the frequency of adverse events. And it mentions an in-text table. And of course, any good safety section would have an in-text table showing the most common adverse events. This one is about a page in length, and that's what we instructed the wizard to give us. We recommend you take more than you're used to, because in fact, if you want, you can cut off some from the bottom. In this case, we asked for a full page, it gave it to us, and then it tells you the cut that gives you that page. In this case, it's 2.3%. A lot of people will look at that and say, that looks really oddball. Maybe I will go for 3% and get rid of some of these small events down here that were in any case, very uncommon. It's up to you, but we always want to have more rather than less. However, what are the differences? What's going on in there? Well, let's go see what TriloDocs wrote. It starts with a text mentioning the most common events. The most common TEAs greater than 3% were as follows for each group. You might argue that you don't really need this text because it's all here, and that's correct. I, for example, probably wouldn't have bothered with this, but many people like this, and so we do it. The 3% is chosen by TriloDocs to give you between 5 and 10 events. Less than that doesn't really tell you much, and more than that gives you these long lists of events, which also isn't very useful. The idea here is to give you really the top, sort of the greatest hits in terms of events and in terms of the higher frequency. If you don't like this because you're a real hardcore lean medical writer, you could simply delete that. The part you definitely don't want to delete, though, because it really saves you time and is of high interest, is what about the comparisons between placebo, low dose, and high dose? So before we look at that, notice that, of course, this is a dose finding study. You have placebo, which is 0. You then have low dose, and then you have high dose. So the first thing TriloDocs looks for is linear, straight dose relationships between the three. And that would mean placebo would have the lowest percentage. Low dose would then have a clinically relevantly higher frequency compared to placebo. And high dose would have a clinically relevantly higher frequency compared to low dose. TriloDocs has looked through the entire TEAE table and did not find that anywhere. There was no indication of a dose relationship for the frequency of TEAEs across the dose groups. You now know that. You don't need to go through and painstakingly, with your highlighter pen, look to see if you can find any. TriloDocs has done that for you. However, that's not the only kind of threshold effect you could have. There are 2 others, and in fact, TriloDocs found an example of each one here. So let's take a look. There was an indication of a clinically relevant higher frequency, in this case 3%, for the TEAEs in the higher dose groups for the following. Somnolence, 0 for placebo, 3.8 for low dose, 3.6 for high dose. Using a cut of 3%, this shows you what I would call the threshold of any dose of fab drug, gives you a 3% or higher frequency of somnolence compared to placebo. You may feel that, well, 3%, that's not such a big deal. Okay, if you don't want it, you don't need to include this. You can just delete this and say there was not an indication. But at least you know this is in there, and all other threshold effects or something would be less than 3% or would not be a threshold. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. However, we also find the other kind of threshold effect, and that is shown by upper respiratory tract infection, 0 for placebo, 0 for low dose, and 3.6 for high dose. Here, you have to have the high dose of fab drug in order to see that 3% or higher frequency compared to low dose and placebo. These sentences here have now done all the heavy lifting work of going through the table and looking for these kind of relationships. Trust me, having done it many times by hand myself, this is very challenging to do, especially when you have total fab drug and overall columns in there to make it confusing. We choose a very low percent compared to 0 here, 3, even though you might say, well, Barry, I think 3 is kind of low. Maybe we should use 5. If you want to use 5, you would simply say there was no indication of a clinically relevant higher frequency. because neither of these meet the 5% cut. I do want to show you, though, something that was not identified by TriloDocs, and that is here headache, because it's interesting why it did not pick this. We have a 3.6% frequency with placebo. Low dose fat drug leaps up to 9%. If you just look at those two, you might think, whoa, look at that. But then by adding even more fat drug, it then goes back down to 6%, which is not 3% higher than placebo. Therefore, that is not a classical threshold effect. Had this been 6.6, then it would have picked it out. It also doesn't care about things where placebo is higher than the two fat drug things, because placebo cannot cause side effects. This is safety. So it may help placebo, and this was a study in schizophrenia, so you can see both of the frequencies of schizophrenia were lower with fat drug because it treats schizophrenia, but that is not a safety finding. So what you see here is, and again, we'll then do this for severe events, for related events, for serious, for deaths, etc., leading to discontinuation, AEs of special interest. All of that is a huge time saving. And as Phoebe was mentioning about data analysis and so on, no longer do we have these week-long data deep dives where we have to look at every row and think, is this interesting? What does this mean? TriloDocs has laid it out for you like this, and you now know what there is. And this is what I'm referring to when I talk to experienced medical writers who use TriloDocs and say they really like the peace of mind you have that you can go to bed at night and know everything in there has been identified. You simply need to discuss with the team, are any of these things really a serious safety issue that we need to pull out and discuss for the regulatory authorities? So that is my little demo of the original source tables and what TriloDocs does with it. I hope it has given you an idea of the real strengths and what TriloDocs really brings to the art of medical writing. We will now take some time, and we are happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.